Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. It's a familiar little ditty that's used by many to remember what happened to the 6 wives of Henry VIII, but it doesn't really tell us their full story. Today I'm going to be talking in a bit more detail about what happened to the 6 women in the rhyme, and asking whether Henry VIII actually had 6 wives. Now, the first divorced refers, of course, to Catherine of Aragon, one of the daughters of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. She was originally married to Henry's older brother Arthur. However, he died within just a few months of their marriage. There was quite a lot of diplomatic toing and froing over her status in England and whether she would go on to marry his brother, the new heir, Prince Henry. It actually hadn't been resolved by the time that Henry VII died in 1509, but one of the first things that Henry VIII did was to marry his brother's widow. Now, it looks like in the early years they had a loving and supportive marriage. She played a political role within England. There's several occasions where she is undertaking ambassadorial duties on behalf of her father, and in 1513, when Henry VIII is fighting in France, she stays behind as regent of England. However, there was a big problem within their marriage, and that was the fact that they didn't have a living male child. And with, time passing, Catherine is getting older, it's increasingly becoming unlikely that she is going to be able to give Henry VIII the heir that he desires. And in 1527, he starts looking for a way out of his marriage. And the line that is pursued is actually not a divorce, but an annulment. Now, this would declare their marriage to be null and void, as if it had never happened. The grounds for this annulment is that it was against divine law for Henry to have married his brother's widow in the first place. This is sort of ignoring the fact that they had received papal dispensation for the marriage, or rather saying that that papal dispensation should never have been given. And, it's said that Henry even believed that his lack of heir was divine punishment for having married his sister-in-law. When it becomes clear that the then Pope is not going to give them an annulment, Henry VIII and his advisors take the line instead of declaring Henry to be the supreme head of the church within England, thus beginning the process of separating England from the Catholic Church. This opens the way for many changes in the future, including the dissolution of the monasteries and, further down the line, the Protestant Reformation in England. It also meant that on the 23rd of May in 1533, the Archbishop of Canterbury was able to annul the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. This also made their daughter, the then Princess Mary, illegitimate. Her title is changed to the Lady Mary, and she is no longer part of the official line of succession for the English throne. Catherine is excluded from the royal court by now. She is prevented from seeing her daughter anymore, and she dies on the 7th of January 1536 and is buried in Peterborough Abbey, which is now Peterborough Cathedral. Next up was Anne Boleyn, possibly the most well-known of Henry VIII's wives. The first mention of Anne at the English royal court comes in 1522. But it isn't until 1526 that she seems to have caught Henry VIII's attention. Before that time, her sister Mary was actually Henry VIII's mistress, and it looks like in the first instance he was just trying to replace Mary with Anne. However, as a lot of us know, Anne doesn't want to be the royal mistress, and in 1527 it's agreed instead that she will marry Henry. However, as we've just seen, it's not a quick process to manage to get an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, and it's not until January 1533 that Henry and Anne finally marry in secret. Now, this is, of course, 5 months before his marriage to Catherine of Aragon is annulled, but apparently a bit of bigamy is okay if you're Henry VIII. Anne's daughter Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, was born in September 1534, but her parents' marriage does not last much longer than that, certainly not anywhere near the length of time that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had lasted. Anne is accused of treason. She's tried on the 15th of May 1536 on the grounds of adultery with several of sort of Henry VIII's close companions, people who were part of his inner circle, his privy chamber, and so on, and these included her own brother George Boleyn. The 4 commoners, so that's to say they didn't have a noble title, they were tried on the 12th of May and found guilty. George and Anne were tried by their peers, and as they were members of the nobility, that meant that they were literally tried by peers, members of the House of Lords. According to legal procedure at the time, they weren't allowed lawyers to speak on their behalf at the trial, and so they presented their own defence, something that it was reported that they both did with sort of great defiance, great competency and fluency, but it was not enough to save them. The men were executed on the 17th of May 1536, which was the same day that the Archbishop of Canterbury declared that Anne's marriage to Henry VIII was also null and void. The excuse that they used this time was that he had previously had sexual relations with her sister, and thus their marriage should never have been valid. She was executed on the 19th of May 1536 and buried alongside her brother George in the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula within the grounds of the Tower of London. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour, a young lady who had served as a lady of waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Jane would give Henry his long-awaited male heir. Edward, the future Edward VI, was born on the 12th of October 1537. Tragically, Jane herself died just 12 days later. The exact cause of her death is debated, but it is most likely that it arose from complications from the childbirth. Jane was buried in St George's Chapel in the grounds of Windsor Castle, and 10 years later Henry VIII himself would be buried alongside her. Henry did not remarry immediately after Jane's death, but as we head towards 1539, it's becoming increasingly clear that Henry needs allies within Europe. His split from the Catholic Church has left him dangerously isolated. And when it comes to looking for a new wife, attention turns towards the German states, where Protestantism is more widespread, and in particular they're looking at the Duchy of Cleves, where there's a sort of brand of Protestantism which is more closely aligned with England's, in that it is not sort of very hardcore evangelical, it's sort of more of walking a line between not being part of the Catholic Church but still having some of the more kind of conservative traditional elements of religion to it. And so a marriage is arranged between Henry and Anna of Cleves. She arrives in England on the 31st of December 1540, and the following day Henry VIII greets her in disguise. Now, the tale of this absolutely disastrous first meeting was likely embellished after the fact, and certainly it was not until the 17th century that the description of Anna as the Flanders mare begins to be circulated. However, Henry does seem to have had reservations from the start. Despite these reservations, the wedding goes ahead on the 6th of January, but Henry is unable to consummate the marriage. And by the time we reach the 20th of June, his attention has turned to one of Anna's ladies-in-waiting, Catherine Howard, and by the 20th of June, Anna herself is aware of this fact. A few days later, Anna is ordered to remove herself from court. This makes it easier for Henry to travel across the River Thames to Catherine Howard's family's home and meet with her. The marriage between Henry and Anna is declared illegal on the 9th of July, and an annulment was confirmed in Parliament on the 12th of July, and the annulment is on the grounds of a pre-contract on the side of Anna. She was provided with an allowance, a household and several properties, and she's subsequently referred to as the King's beloved sister. Towards the end of Henry's life, she was also given some new properties, including Anne Boleyn's childhood home, Hever Castle. Anna died on the 16th of July 1557. She is actually the last of the 6 wives of Henry VIII to die, and she outlives him by 10 years. She is buried in Westminster Abbey. Henry married his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, on the 28th of July 1540, which is the same day that Thomas Cromwell was executed. By now, Henry himself was 49 years old. He's overweight, he's suffering from chronic pain from a leg injury. His marriage to Catherine Howard would last for little over a year and a half. In October of 1541, Thomas Cranmer was informed that Catherine had had premarital relations with 2 men, Henry Manox and Francis Derham. Initially sceptical, Henry VIII had the 2 men questioned. They confirmed those relations, and on the 6th of November, Henry left Catherine. He left the royal court and he never saw her again. Under interrogation, Derham revealed Catherine's affair with a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, Sir Thomas Culpeper. Now, this affair took place during 1541. Unlike Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard was not brought to trial. She was declared guilty of treason by Parliament in an Act of Attainder and executed on the 13th of February 1542 alongside Lady Jane Rochford, the widow of George Boleyn, and Catherine's accomplice in her affair with Sir Thomas Culpeper. Catherine was buried near her cousins, Anne and George, in the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula. There's no evidence that the marriage was annulled, and with no children to affect the line of succession, it's likely that an annulment was not felt to be necessary. Henry was deeply affected by Catherine Howard's betrayal, and he remained unmarried until 1543. On the 12th of July of that year, he married Katherine Parr, a twice-widowed lady who at that time was in his daughter Lady Mary's household. Now, Catherine Parr was an intelligent and witty woman who loved finery and the arts. In her religious belief, she tended towards Protestantism. She published a number of books, the first English queen to do so, and like Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, she acted as regent when Henry was fighting in France in 1544. Their marriage was not without its difficulties. In the final year of his life, Henry began to tire of spirited religious debates with Catherine, and at that time, religious conservative individuals at the royal court sought to implicate Catherine in Protestant heresy. It went so far as a warrant being issued for her arrest. However, Catherine received word of what was being planned. She was able to rush to Henry and to beg for his forgiveness. He chose to spare her, and she went on to outlive him. She is the survived in that rhyme that we began with. Within 5 months of Henry's death, Catherine had married Thomas Seymour, one of Jane Seymour's brothers, and the man who Catherine had hoped to marry before the king's attention had settled on her. Their marriage lasted just 15 months until her death on the 5th of September 1548, just 2 days after giving birth to a daughter. Catherine Parr was buried in a church in the grounds of Sudeley Castle, and she is the only English queen to be buried within the grounds of a private home. So there we have it. With 3 annulments to his name, Henry VIII technically had 6 wedding ceremonies, but only 3 wives. And our ditty, that perhaps should go annulled, tried, annulled and beheaded, died, annulled, attainted and beheaded, survived. But perhaps that wouldn't be quite so catchy.